All of Turkey's immediate Middle Eastern neighbors also have Kurdish minorities. And of course, particularly since the conflict with the PKK erupted in 1984, Turkey has tended to view its relations with these countries through this counter-terrorism lens, very much driven by a need to counter the rise of Kurdish nationalism. And this sort of plays out on several different levels. On the one hand, you have countries like Syria, Iran using the Kurds against Turkey or against Iraq. You know, it depends on the time and the circumstance to undermine each other politically. So, for instance, the Syrian regime, Hafez al-Assad, for many, many years, as you know, hosted the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan in Syria, and he was permitted to operate there on the sole condition, of course, that he not mobilize Kurds against the regime, but against Turkey. And that was partly because, you know, Turkey controls the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, and there was this long-running and continuing water dispute with Iraq and with Syria, and that was meant to pressure Turkey into releasing more water for the dams. Similarly, you had the Shah of Iran supporting the Iraqi Kurds against the regime in Baghdad. But there comes a certain point when things get out of hand, as these countries see it, and join forces against the Kurds. And I believe that we're at that point now, particularly with Turkey and Iran, who feel deeply threatened by the rise of Kurdish nationalism. Turkey today has two-thirds of its Syrian border now run by the PKK. And next door, the Iraqi Kurds have said they're holding a referendum on independence, which will take place on the 25th of September. And in the face of, you know, global resistance, including from the United States, they're going ahead and doing that. And all of this, of course, is very threatening for Turkey and also, of course, for Iran, which has the second largest Kurdish population in the world after Turkey, and an increasingly restive one. Some people would say that Istanbul is the world's largest Kurdish city. And of course, however much the rhetoric may not reflect this, particularly in the case of the PKK, it was founded, let's all recall, to establish Kurdistan that would unite the Kurds from Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. And, you know, no country, of course, can just take that kind of organized separatist movement lightly, particularly if it's an armed one. But of course, let's also not forget, be it Turkey, Iran, Syria, or Iraq, all of these countries have dealt a very, very poor hand to their ethnic Kurdish populations, repressed them, often brutally. And so, you know, there's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, and ultimately it's primarily the responsibility of the state and of the government to address these problems. I wouldn't expect a guerrilla movement to find the solution primarily. I would expect the government to do that. And for a while, for the first time in Turkey, with the rise to power of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party, you saw a real effort to actually address this problem through political means. For the first time, a Turkish government sat down with Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK leader, with the commanders in the field. You had the Oslo talks where they met 11 times and try and fix this. But unfortunately, a convergence of circumstances, be it Erdogan's own domestic political agenda, be it the Arab uprisings and the effect it had in Syria in particular, all of this converged to sort of upend that very hopeful moment for all of us, unfortunately. So now we're in a situation where, of course, we're kind of heading back to the horrible days of the 1990s when the conflict and the attendant human rights abuses, the very brutal crackdown by the army, seems to be making a comeback. There are two prevailing dominant groups. There's the PKK, led by Abdullah Öcalan, who's sitting in a Turkish prison actually since 1999, and it's remarkable that his movement remains intact and is growing in influence and certainly acquiring more and more territory. And the other main Kurdish group is led by Masoud Barzani, who I would say, thanks largely to serendipity, the US occupation of Iraq has, managed to get his country, well, it's not a country quite yet, but the area, the land that he controls, to the point of independence. And they are ideologically very different. Masoud Barzani is, a sort of tribal figure. His father, Mullah Mustafa Barzani, was leading the Kurdish independence movement in Iraq and also in Iran partly. The Mahabad Republic, was declared in the 1940s in Iran. It was very short-lived and is often referred to as the first independent Kurdish state, and Mullah Mustafa Barzani was the war minister of that government, if we call it one. And it's much more of a tribal sort of conservative movement where they stress Kurdishness, whereas paradoxical as it may sound, the PKK sort of disavows ethnic nationalism and increasingly talks about this very sort of radical communalism, partly inspired by this American anarchist from Brooklyn who's no longer with us, Murray Bookchin, and professes to sort of not believe in borders, but in people power and people just governing their space. The fact that the Kurds were so, neglected for decades by the state, poverty, lack of education, the feudal system with these aghas and sheikhs sort of exploiting people, all made the PKK's leftist ideology a very appealing one. And they very successfully mobilized women as well, which is what renders the PKK quite unique and has, actually made it hugely popular in the Western media with these Kurdish women fighters in Syria, in particular, now on the cover of Marie Claire magazine. As you said, there are many conservative Kurds, and the AKP managed to attract quite a lot of their votes for a very long time. Indeed, to the point that the PKK began to see Erdogan and the AKP as a huge challenge and a threat. I think it's really, at this stage anyway, quite unrealistic to imagine that, they could come together. I mean, look at Iraqi Kurdistan, where already, for decades, the main Kurdish parties have been at each other's throats, literally, and remain so. There's a major bloc inside Iraqi Kurdistan, the Change Movement, that is in opposition to this referendum. So it's very hard to imagine how, you could, on top of all of that internal conflict within Iraqi Kurdistan, then get those parties to somehow come together with the PKK, not to mention the Iranian Kurdish groups, and then the other rival Syrian Kurdish groups. But setting all of that aside, I think that surprisingly, the borders of nation states are proving incredibly resilient, and it's quite extraordinary to see the United States especially pushing so hard against this Iraqi Kurdish referendum. So bearing that in mind, and also I think countries like Bangladesh, Kosovo, and others have shown us that unless there's a major power, world power or regional power that's backing your independence, it's very hard to pull that off. So I really don't, at the present anyway, envisage a scenario where, you know, any major power would be looking to dismember Turkey, even though Turkey insists that's what's happening, or even in Iran for that matter. I think the major powers are looking to preserve borders, not erase them. But having said that, I think Iraq, what's happening in Iraq today, should serve as warning to countries like Turkey and Iran and Syria about what happens when you don't accommodate your Kurdish population. And Iraq, after the American occupation, the Kurds got more than any Kurds anywhere else in the region. They had their federal status recognized, their rights constitutionally enshrined. A Kurd was made the president. You had other Kurds in the cabinet. And despite that, the Kurds are just simply not interested in remaining part of Iraq, not interested. And I think it's very much in Turkey's interest, in Iran's interest to look at that and avoid having their own Kurds get to that point.